Hi there. This is now the third video that I'm making on the books that I've been reading recently. Jordan Peterson's We Who Wrestle with God, Ezra Klein's Why We're Polarized, and Kevin Vanhoozer's Mere Christian Hermeneutics. And in this video, I'm really getting to the heart of what has been exercising me and sort of, I guess, tugging on my heartstrings as well as I've been reading these three books. And in my own thinking, I've come to think of it as the Klein problem, because I first came across it in Ezra Klein, and he presents it with real pathos, I think. It's the idea that we don't have full control over the process by which we arrive at the opinions that we hold, that we can't be sure that we're true, that we're correct objectively. And he presents it in a really powerful way, I think, in Why We're Polarized. So he starts off with this idea that the political landscape today is incredibly fractured and dichotomous. And then he introduces this idea of the more information hypothesis. He says he can't remember the number of times people have come to him saying, if only civic education were better, if only we could teach people better critical thinking or whatever, then we'd all find that we agreed in the end, or we'd approximate towards a more consensual view. And Klein doesn't agree. He doesn't think that we can simply educate ourselves to consensus. And he has at least three powerful reasons why this is the case. And I feel persuaded by them. The first is what he calls identity protective cognition. Let me just read you a quote from Ezra Klein's Why We're Polarized. He says, as a way of avoiding dissonance and estrangement from valued groups, individuals subconsciously resist factual information that threatens their defining values. You set a high bar for believing things that threaten the way you see the world. And I think this is both borne out in research and demonstrably true. We don't jump to conclusions that challenge our fundamental views of the world. And the second thing he talks about is motivated reasoning and motivated identity. He has a chapter that is entitled The Psychological Roots of Our Policies. And it chimes in with ideas that are prominent both on the liberal and conservative wings of politics. You think of Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, for example, talking about how the different political persuasions are almost hard-coded into people psychologically. Or from a more progressive point of view, think of George Lakoff and his idea that politics is basically a distinction between what he calls a strict father morality on the conservative side and a nurturant parent morality on the more liberal side. And Klein says thinking is mostly just rationalization, mostly just a search for supporting evidence. Why should I believe the things I already believe? That's what thinking is about primarily for Klein. And then he goes on to say, in the work of gathering evidence and reasoning, it's actually what that process is the process by which we trick ourselves, his language, into finding the answers we want. Then what's the right way to search for answers, he says? How can we try and get out of this almost death spiral of simply seeking confirmation of what we already believe? Well, for Klein, it gets worse before it gets better. He talks about the nature of reasoning as a group activity. Another quote, it isn't possible to be rational by yourself, he says. Rationality is inherently a collective project. Challenges some of the real sacred cows of Enlightenment thinking, doesn't it? We all think of ourselves, or like to think of ourselves, as the captains of our own ship, deciding for ourselves what's right and wrong. And Klein is suggesting it's not as easy as that. We believe what the people around us believe. And I think historically that bears itself out, doesn't it? Most of us share most of our beliefs with what most early 21st century people in the culture around us believe. And that's no accident for any of us, whether we're religious or secular. And it bears thinking about what is motivating the beliefs that I have. And to his great credit, and this is the thing that really struck me about Why We're Polarized, to his great credit, Klein includes himself in this reasoning, in this death spiral. He questions his own motivation, the reasons by which he arrived at his own political convictions. Let me read you a couple of quotes. I think these quotes are really, they draw pathos. I have a huge admiration for Klein in these moments in the text. One of them is this. He writes, "The question isn't whether I fall victim to motivated reasoning too, or whether I'm less physically guarded when faced with information that accords with my values and worldview. Of course I am," he says. "The question is what it means that all of us are doing this, to greater or lesser degrees, all the time." Credit to Klein as a political commentator, I think, for recognizing and acknowledging and naming this in the first person. And he also recognizes the influence of his own political identity. Let me read you one final quotation. "My whole career," he says, "and much of politics more generally, is based on the idea that gathering good information helps us understand hard policy issues. But once our political identities and interests push themselves in front of our cognition, that model of reasoning falls to pieces." Wow, I think that's incredibly honest and confronting from a political commentator. And the question that it leaves us with, of course, is, well, where does that leave Klein and his political convictions? He ends up, when you boil it down, I think, saying that the important thing is being willing to challenge our own assumptions. But I don't think that gets him off the hook. I don't think he thinks it gets him off the hook either. Because the predisposition to challenge your assumptions can just become one more part of your political identity. I am of the group of those who challenge our political assumptions, as opposed to those idiots over there who don't challenge their political assumptions. And it becomes a sort of get out of jail free card. I have some sort of self-critique, therefore I'm okay. But that just becomes part of the identity that you're reinforcing. And so you end up with this Ouroboros, this snake eating its own tail, consuming itself. You can't get out of the spiral of self-consumption. Whatever you try to appeal to say, I'm not simply believing what I'm being told to believe by my group, or what my instincts or my psychology, my innate psychology are pushing me to believe. Whatever you grasp onto to say that's not me becomes part of the identity that's you. It's like that illustration of the Christian apologist Cornelius Van Til, who talks about, I think he talks about it in relation to Spinoza, if I'm not mistaken, but it's the idea of the person made out of water in the ocean of water, erecting a ladder of water to climb out of the water. It's whatever you try to do becomes more of the same, becomes more of your identity. And it very quickly, doesn't it, becomes a counsel of despair. I cannot bootstrap myself out of what may be my blind spots and prejudices and instincts and the culture in which I've grown up to do anything more than simply reflect in my own views, the views of those around me, or the views of powerful actors that I'm unaware of. So are we left simply saying, well, I believe what I believe because of my psychology, because of my upbringing, and you believe what you believe because of your psychology and your upbringing, and there's nothing more to it than that? Well, we better not be, had we? Because that is an incredibly fragile and fractious and agonistic basis upon which to try and do this thing that we call democracy, which is fundamentally based on the idea of persuasion and persuadability. And so Klein ultimately, I think, finds himself, when he switches off the light and goes to bed at night and lies in his bed and everything is sort of written and his column is out for the week, with the haunting prospect of there being no exit to this circularity. It's the nature freedom ground motive that I was trying to introduce in the last video. We have a fundamental conviction as moderns that we are radically free. I decide what I believe. I am rational. I come to my own convictions. And we have an unshakable commitment as moderns to the idea that there's nothing outside the natural world. And both of those attack each other. It is very hard to see how both of those can be true. And this is one particular manifestation of that, the idea of persuasion and persuadability. Now, where this gets really, really interesting, what I wasn't expecting, was that this problem also comes up in the other books that I was reading concurrently with Klein. And so Jordan Peterson sees the same problem. He has this long passage where he self-critiques, essentially, and questions his own motivation for coming to the judgments that he comes to. Let me just read you part of that. He says, do I believe this, the whole sort of framework of his thought, only because it requires the least effort, or because it conveniently furthers my career, which undoubtedly for him it does, doesn't it? Because it exists in contradistinction to the theories that I am competing with. It's a really powerful question, and again, credit to Peterson for asking it. He goes on, such assessment also calls into question the purpose or aim actually served by the new idea. Do I believe this because it's an idea that's in keeping with my commitment to the truth, in relationship to the ethical goal toward which I'm genuinely aiming? Or, once again, does it only do something for me when what is me is construed in the narrowest of senses? Now, unlike Klein, Peterson thinks he can cut the Gordian knot. He thinks he's got a way of evaluating which of his impulses and convictions are true and which to follow. And this is the way that he does it. I quote, Did I properly call upon what is highest to aid me in my exploratory venture? Or did I falter and allow myself to become possessed by concerns other than those allied with the upward, striving, redemptive path of the truth? If not, what spirit did I call upon? And as a result, what spirit answered when I sent forward my query? So here is Peterson's solution. There's what he calls the highest, and there are baser motives. And if I'm following this thing he calls the highest, which I went into a little bit in the last video, it's cultivating maturity, living in the zone of proximal development, taking responsibility and so forth. If I follow that, then I can be sure that I'm doing the right thing. And within its own little universe, that works very powerfully as a criterion of deciding what convictions to follow. But of course, it's by no means universal. He has constructed, with the help of Jung and others, this framework for living, but it is by no means uncontested. Why should maturity and responsibility be, quote unquote, the highest? Why should that be a commitment to the truth? Why should the truth of humanity not be a much more Epicurean or hedonistic truth, for example? Because there are those who have thought across the thousands of years of philosophy that precisely those Epicurean or hedonistic values were the ones that were most fundamentally human. And so it's very hard, as Peterson goes to bed at night, turns off the light once he's finished all his podcasts and all his writing, and he stares at the ceiling, not to have, I think, the same haunting idea that Klein has. Now, he may dismiss it more quickly, he may be more aggressively resistant to it, but I think it still haunts his thinking. Why is this the highest? Why is what, by virtue of what outside my own feelings and convictions, dictate that this should be the highest? What outside the Jungian framework in which I'm working dictates that this should be the highest? Can I persuade others that this should be the highest in any other way than appealing precisely to those instincts and intuitions that I'm trying to say should not be simply the things that are guiding us? It doesn't mean that everything he says is worthless. It means that it is always haunted by the Klein problem, as I'm calling it. And the third book that I'm reading at the moment, Vanhoozer also addresses this Klein problem in his book Mere Christian Hermeneutics. The questions we ask, he says, and the answers that seem plausible to us are inseparable from our broader frame of reference. Klein could have written that, couldn't he? Peterson, in that passage that I've just quoted, could have written that. And in fact, Vanhoozer quotes Jonathan Haidt's idea that intuitions come first and reasoning comes second in political thinking. He could have also quoted George Lakoff saying very similar things. So this question is systematically addressed in these very, very different writers, none of whom could be confused with either of the other two on an ideological level. But Vanhoozer, and this is where I think it gets really interesting in me, Christian hermeneutics, he takes it down a different track because, of course, Vanhoozer has tools available to him in grappling with this question that are neither available to Peterson nor to Klein, in that Vanhoozer can appeal to a God who, as far as he is concerned, really is there, not as a function of his own convictions, but in a way that doesn't depend on Vanhoozer believing this, that, or the other, a God who is objectively there. And that allows him to elaborate, I think, a distinctively Christian approach to the Klein problem, which he says belongs in special hermeneutics rather than general hermeneutics. So he's saying that this is not, I'm not suggesting that everybody should do this. This is a tool that Christians can use to solve this problem that is not a universal tool. And he doesn't claim it to be a universal tool. And it comes in two stages. There are two things that he says. I think the first thing is broadly shareable among people of religious conviction and none, and the second of them certainly isn't. The first is the idea that you read with the grain of a text. And so Vanhoozer in Mere Christian Hermeneutics says that we should seek the reading of a text, a biblical text, that most glorifies God. And then when the accusation comes, well, isn't that just an arbitrary criterion? Why not choose, you can make up any silly criterion that you want. Why not choose any ridiculous criterion as opposed to that one? And his response is that is what the texts of the Bible are systematically doing themselves. They are seeking to glorify God. And so when you read for glorifying God, you're reading with the grain of the text. Now, that doesn't necessarily make it suddenly that everybody should necessarily read in that way, whether they're Christians or not, but it does distinguish between a way that reads with the grain of the text and other readings that, although they might be persuasive for others, do not read with the grain of the text. So that gets you to some way down the road of deciding what is a legitimate or right way to read a biblical text. But then the second point, and this is really where I think Vanhoozer distinguishes his approach from the others, is the idea that our reading and therefore our persuasions and convictions are in dialogue and ultimately conditioned by a voice from outside of us. And I think this is what neither Klein nor Peterson can, within their own frame of reference, reliably appeal to. And this is why Klein lies in bed at night wondering whether his political convictions are formed simply as a result of his political tribe or whatever. And this is why I think Peterson should perhaps wonder more than he does seem to about that question. But this is the way that Vanhoozer deals with it. First of all, he embraces the supernatural. There is an ineliminably supernatural dimension to persuasion and conviction for Vanhoozer, and he is unapologetic about that. And within that framework, he holds two convictions in tension, not in contradiction, but in tension, in the sense that neither of them must be sacrificed on the altar of the other one. Both of these things need to be affirmed. And the first is that persuasion is necessary. And this comes through again and again in the Bible. The word persuasion pops up in the book of Acts a great deal. So think of the first Christian sermon, the sort of paradigm-setting Christian sermon. In Acts chapter 2, Peter stands up in front of the crowd, and in Acts chapter 2, verse 14, we read, "Then Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice and addressed the crowd, 'Fellow Jews, and all of you who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say.'" So there's a dynamic of persuasion going on here. I want to try and set certain connections and facts before you, and I think you should be persuaded by those facts. Or think of the parable of the seed that Jesus tells, that the sower sows the word of God, sows it liberally, everywhere, tells everybody, seeks to persuade, seeks to hold out the word of life, using biblical language, to everybody. Or think of Paul on the Areopagus, speaking to a bunch of Greek philosophers. He seeks to persuade everybody. He doesn't try to single out certain people or certain groups within the crowd. He seeks to persuade. And so the first principle is persuasion is necessary. People don't just become Christians by clicking our fingers. People need persuading. But this is where the distinctiveness of the Christian position really comes to the fore, I think. The second position held, the conviction held in tension with that, is that persuasion is not sufficient. Radically not sufficient. And this comes through again in the book of Acts in 13, where Paul and Barnabas are in Pisidian Antioch. And there's this really telling verse. When the Gentiles heard this, what Paul and Barnabas are explaining, they were glad and honoured the word of the Lord, and all who were appointed for eternal life believed. And so there's a sense in which there's a supernatural work going on. There are some of these people appointed to eternal life. When Paul and Barnabas preach to them, they believe, the others don't. But Paul and Barnabas don't know who that is, so they preach to everybody. They seek to persuade everybody. And there's another really telling verse in 1 Corinthians 18, verses 9 and 10. I'll just read the verses. One night, the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one is going to attack or harm you, because I have many people in this city. In other words, there are those who I'm going to persuade through your speaking. Now, I'm not going to tell you who they are. I'm not going to say, just go to this house and that house, forget about the rest. You persuade everybody. Seek to persuade everybody. But there is some subset of those who I will call through your preaching. And this dual truth, persuasion is necessary, persuasion is not sufficient, leads to a really complex and balanced approach, I think, to the Klein problem from a Christian point of view. Because it engenders an attitude of stubborn persistence on the one hand, keep persuading, you never know, but it doesn't tip over into a frustration if any individual is not persuaded, because persuasion is not sufficient. I can speak to any given individual, if I'm a Christian, until I'm blue in the face, and they may not believe. It's not that I've necessarily done anything wrong, or there's one argument that if I trotted it out, it would have clinched the deal. And so I'm not either frustrated with them, I don't get angry with them, and I'm not frustrated necessarily with myself. I can be grieved, and the prophets weep over unbelief. But they don't get angry or frustrated over unbelief, and when they do, they're rebuked. Like when Jonah gets angry over repentance, he's rebuked. And so there's a delicate choreography within this biblical framework, and Vanhoozer touches upon it, to stubborn persistence in persuasion, but not frustration if persuasion doesn't work. Now, outside of that Christian frame, if we come back to Klein and Vanhoozer, you've either got a tendency, a pull towards two different poles. On the one hand, a pull towards saying, well, people are just completely conditioned by their psychology and by what people around them believe. It's two separate worlds. We cannot speak to each other. Polarization is insuperable. Or, on the other extreme, you've got an assumption of bad faith or willful blindness on the other side. My side are being honest. The other side know that we are correct, but they're pretending. And both of those rip societies apart. If you say it's two separate worlds that can't speak to each other, or the other side are just being evil, you can't build a cohesive society. And it is hard in that context to resist persuasion simply becoming a power game. If I shout louder for longer than the opposite side, and if I I don't know, control the education system. If I silence the other side, then I'll win. If I pay for more adverts, I'll win. Persuasion becomes a brute force game, which is perhaps in part what we're seeing in our politics at the moment. It's hard to resist that if there's nothing outside the Klein problem, nothing outside the Ouroboros eating its own tail. But I think the sweet spot for social cohesion and for democracy, this thing that we call democracy, this grand experiment, this wonderful experiment that we call democracy, the sweet spot for that is that persuasion is necessary but insufficient. And if we've got both of those, I think we can navigate the polarized society, perhaps in which we're living, in a healthier, more sophisticated, more robust way than being pulled to either this pole of it's two separate worlds, there's no point in trying to argue, or the other side are being willfully blind, they know that we're right, they're just playing games.